The recording has now started. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I'll now turn it over to today's presenters.
Hello, my name is Veronica Willeto DeCrane, and I want to start by welcoming you all to this conversation on trauma-informed systems change. We hope each of you will feel comfortable and safe to ask questions and contribute to the discussion. Next slide, please. So to start us off in a good way, I like to share with you this photo and this quote that will hopefully ground us so that we can put aside any distractions and focus on this time that we have together. The photo you see on the screen is of Denetre, which is the sacred land of my people, the Dene people. It's capturing a moment of change when the snow is starting to melt and the sun is beginning to come up and the air still feels crisp, but promises to get warmer. The quote you are reading is by Navajo poet Lucy Tapahanso. It's from her poem, A Blessing. It's actually a speech that she gave during a commencement ceremony, which is another moment of change that we hope many of our young people experience. It's setting for us an intention to bring good energy through our words, and we hope that all of us can do that today. I invite you to join me in taking 3 big breaths. Breathe in through your nose and breathe out through your mouth. Notice how your belly expands as you breathe in, and then how your shoulders relax as you breathe out. Next slide, please. So she Veronica Willeto DeCrane Unishia, Juan Flana Nishlana Kedana Bashichin, Twitch Eatney Dashanella, Tratnasani Dashache, Tsech Bitwada Nasha, Do Billings, Montana de Kashta, Quit Ego Dana Sanishle. My name is Veronica Willeto DeCrane. I'm Dana of the Minihogans clan and born of the Mexican clan. My maternal grandparents are of the Tangle clan and my paternal grandparents are of the Bitterwater clan. I grew up in Ojo Encino, which is a community in present day New Mexico. It's an area that is often referred to as the checkerboard area of the Navajo Reservation. And it's also considered the Far East or Eastern Agency of the Navajo Nation. I'm joining you from Billings, Montana, which is the sacred lands of the Crow, Blackfeet, and other tribes here in the Plains area. This is where I currently live with my family. I'm joining you excited to spend this time together and to talk about systems change. I've been with the National Native Children's Trauma Center for over 2 years. Before that, I worked with after-school programming and with schools in Montana. My experience with systems change was primarily with working in the context of public schools. So I'm honored to facilitate today and to be learning alongside all of you as we talk about change in the context of tribal juvenile justice. Next slide, please. I want to take this time to give my colleagues from the National Native Children's Trauma Center the chance to introduce themselves. And we're going to go ahead and start with our fearless leader, Maegan.
Hello, good afternoon. It's great to be here. I'm glad to see so many people joining our session. There's a lot of virtual events happening, so it's really great that you all chose to come and attend this week's long activities and events that are taking place. Again, my name is Maegan Rides at the Door. I have been serving as the director for the center now for a little over 5 years. Prior to that, I was a mental health counselor, also a victim advocate, and in various youth programming as well. So I would say that in my role at our center, we have just amazing staff that you'll see here, and I'm going to pass it along to Lisa Stark to introduce herself.
Uju Ginoa, Sagamakwe, Indigo, Ojibwe Mong, Migizi, Nado Dame, Machkizi Bing, Nindunjaba. My name is Lisa. I am of the Eagle Clan, and I'm an enrolled member from the Bad River Tribe of Northern Wisconsin. I currently serve as a mental health TTA specialist with National Native Children's Trauma Center. But in my career history, I have worked as a case manager, ICWA representative, and supervisor, assistant director in tribal child welfare with my own tribe, as well as the Lakudere tribe in northern Wisconsin. Miigwech, and I will pass this over to Marilyn.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I'm Marilyn Zimmerman. I'm of the Cree Speaker Band of the Nakota people. I'm an enrolled member of the Nakota Dakota Nations on the Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux Reservation in the northeast corner of Montana. I'm a descendant Ojibwe and Nawa descendant. I serve as the Senior Director of Policy and Programs at the Trauma Center. And my background is almost strictly in trauma and trauma systems change and adapting evidence-based trauma treatment models to fit a local cultural context. And yeah, that's me. I'll pass it on to Nona.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nona Main, and I am a member of the Aani and Nakota Nation of Montana, Fort Belknap Indian community. I am of the Upper Quarter Clan of my Aani people. I serve as a training and technical assistant specialist with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. Also, I have been with them for about 1.5 years now. Prior to coming to the Trauma Center, I was a health education specialist for Planned Parenthood of Montana, which is a specialized field of reproductive and sexuality education. And so my work was primarily with Native youth in the surrounding areas of where I was working at the time, which was predominantly the Crow tribe, so serving youth of the Crow tribe. I also have worked in my own community, serving our youth here at home, and working in that capacity with youth development, helping them learn life skills, healthy relationships, communication and negotiation skills, things like that, just so that they are able to develop healthy relationships in all areas of their life. I've also worked in different capacities with advisory councils for Native women's health in Montana across different areas of breast cancer and cervical health prevention, HIV prevention, everything in that public health field. And so moving into this field has been a fun transition in broadening my public health experience. And I'm very happy and excited to be here and help in whatever way I can to create systems change within juvenile justice. And I will pass it on to Laura.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today and having this conversation with you all. I am coming to you from Missoula, Montana, which is home to the original lands of the Kalispel and Salish people. I am not a tribal member, and I have had the privilege of working at the National Native Children's Trauma Center for going on 4 years now. Prior to that, my background is in child welfare, and I served did some direct case practice, supervision, and then some workforce development training across the state of Montana for just shy of 10 years. And my time at the trauma center has really been focused on coming alongside tribes who are working to develop trauma-informed systems, whether that's juvenile justice, their child welfare programs, their court systems, and whatnot. So that has been the last 4 years of is partnering and really trying to create policies and procedures that support trauma-informed practices in a program that's truly sustainable over the course of time. So I appreciate getting to be here with you all today, and I'm looking forward to some of the great questions you all have posed.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves. And as you can see, I work with a lot of very strong women, and I'm very proud and honored to be working with all of you. And I'm excited that more folks will get to know you as we answer some questions today. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to provide a brief overview before we get started. We're going to be having some preliminary questions, and there are just a few questions that we prepared in advance to get the conversation going as you guys think about questions to ask the panel. And then we're going to move on to questions that we received during registration. So many of you posed questions to the panel when you were registering. And so we're going to cover those. And then with the time left, we're going to address some of the questions that we receive in the Q&A and maybe even the chat. We have quite a few panelists, and so to make best use of the time, I'm going to be calling on panelists to answer questions that may be in their area of expertise. But if you are asking a question and you want to pose it to a specific panelist, you are free to do so. And I've also invited the panelists to contribute to any question if they have anything to add as well. And then at the end, before we close, we're going to be sharing some resources. So if any of the panelists have any resources that they think of as they're answering questions, as well as if any of you from the audience think of a resource, you are welcome to share that anytime in the chat box. But the panelists and we will share some resources at the end before we close. Next slide, please. All right, so let's get this started. We're gonna begin with our first question. And before I pose the question to the panelists, I want to begin by providing a little background for those who are not able to join Monday and Tuesday sessions on building an Indigenous resilience focused lens. From those sessions, we learned that about 80% of juvenile justice involved youth report experiencing trauma. Youth who experience trauma are at an increased risk of emotional, developmental, behavioral problems, such as cognitive functioning, mental health disorders, substance abuse, anxiety, disordered eating, depression, and self-injury, all of which can increase the likelihood of their involvement in delinquency, crime, and the juvenile justice system. Indigenous youth are especially at risk of experiencing trauma. In fact, the prevalence and severity of trauma in many Native communities is what urges all of us to take a system-wide response to preventing, identifying, addressing, and reducing further traumatization. So with that, one of the resources that we're going to share is on essential elements of a trauma-informed juvenile justice system. And so one of those essential elements is trauma-informed policies and procedures that are there to prevent stigmatizing, excluding, or re-traumatizing a young person. So my first question for the panelists today is, what are some examples of policies that can re-traumatize Native youth in the tribal juvenile justice system? And I'll begin with Marilyn.
Hey, Marilyn, we can't hear you yet.
So good at turning it off, I forgot to turn it back on. So what comes to mind for me, if it's in the juvenile justice system, the notion of seclusion or restraint, those are very triggering for youth who have experienced a lot of trauma in the juvenile justice setting. And I know that there are processes and ways to de-escalate a situation that don't involve taking them down and putting them in cuffs and putting them in a room by themselves. And so that's a perfect example of how to become trauma informed, is really begin to look at how do we really use seclusion, and is it really as helpful as a different strategy could be? And then or how do we use restraint? You know, are we triggering? Are we making things worse? Or are we being more helpful? And could we do something else besides restraining? The other one that comes to mind is school-based, and that's the suspension and expulsion policies and procedures that schools have to really push kids, particularly kids of color, out the door. And students are engaging in those behaviors as they are in the juvenile justice setting. They're engaging in behaviors that help them survive in the past. And so it's really good, and you're going to hear me repeat this a couple of times probably today. It's really helping, really understanding that those behaviors we have to depersonalize them. They're not personal, and find ways to be supportive of people who have been triggered, of youth who have been triggered, and in order to better help them better manage their own symptoms, their own anger, their own anxiety around what's happening in their life.
Thank you, Marilyn. Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Veronica, and thanks, Marilyn. I think I would really agree with Marilyn. Any sort of policies and procedures that are designed to drive disconnection are really problematic for youth, for any youth, and especially youth who have experienced trauma. So some that I think about that come to mind specifically are ones around like consequences for not following the expectations of wherever they're at. So whether that's isolation, right? They're not able to participate in the activities that the program has designed because of something that a behavior that they've had, or the loss of visitation with family because they weren't able to gain enough points on their daily kind of check-in sheets. I think that those policies and ways of operating a program design that connection to others that's oftentimes the strongest resiliency factor that a youth has, right? That connection to those activities where they're able to meet with their peers, where they're able to be guided by a mentor, those visits where they're able to connect with their family, whether that's immediate family, extended, or just people that they care about. When we think about what supports youth resilience, it's that connection. So when we're developing policies, when we're reviewing policies, to really be thinking about opportunities to improve fostering connection, and really look at those ones that are driving disconnection.
I know that, and when I'm doing systems change work in schools and addressing behavior in schools, that's one of the areas that we talk about is, the intended consequence, right, of the policy. And you may intend that to be an incentive for them to get connection or to socialize, but that might not actually be how that policy plays out in real life. And so that's definitely a good point, Laura. Does anybody else want to add anything to this question?
I really like what you just said, Veronica. And I always think of that kids have a right to their family, and they have a right to their culture and their identity. So when we have practices that infringe on that, I think we really have to look closely at that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you brought up the culture point, because that is something that we have talked about with with our school's work is how we don't want to use culture as a way to punish or incentivize, because it should be freely accessible. And that's something that the elders that we worked with have shared with us, is them being uncomfortable with that and really wanting any kind of access to culture to be open to all students regardless of their behaviors. If we don't have any other further comments on this question, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one. Okay, so the next question that I have for you guys is another essential component of a trauma-informed juvenile justice system is trauma-informed staff education. So I'm going to ask Laura, since she's on a roll right now, to give her thoughts on, who needs to be educated when it comes to being trauma-informed, and then what do they need to be educated in?
Yeah, I think I'll take a piece of this, and then I know Megan's gonna come in and clean up for me. But this is a hard question for me to answer, because I think the answer is, who doesn't need to be educated in the impacts of trauma to help better understand what we're seeing in front of us in the ways that youth and what we see in youth actions and ways of being, and also what we see in family systems and their ways of being. So to me, it's really who doesn't. I think oftentimes who we forget are people in those kind of less kind of direct care kind of roles. They're not the case managers, they're not the treatment providers, but they're the folks who transport kids from point A to point B. They're the front office staff who are the first people that you see when they walk in the door, whose families interact with, that have really kind of continuous contact. So I think that's often who we forget about, who has the bus drivers that have can have a tremendous influence on youth and their families, and kind of deserve that understanding just as much as those folks, and kind of more of those social service professional type roles. And I think I'll stop there and pass it off to Megan.
Yeah, definitely. Just to add on to that, we've been thinking a lot about what we're educating people in trauma. I know that we've been thinking a lot about what's the foundational trauma training, and does it meet all the needs that we have? There's so many different areas that trauma training could focus on, from the impact on the brain and body physiologically, to thinking about impact on relationships, and thinking about different types of trauma, historical, complex, whatnot, secondary. I mean, there's trauma is such a broad area that really what we're hoping that people can do is get a lot of training in all of these different areas. So at the end of the day, that people can have this perspective in which to practice. One trauma training likely may not give someone everything they need to develop this, what we call trauma lens, so to speak. And that's what we really hope, that people get enough education in all these various areas to be able to apply that lens in their work. And so it's really about continuing to gain this information through different avenues, through different ways, and on these different topic areas to really inform our work that we do.
And I just want to add to that by saying, I think one of the purposes of educating is in trauma, and to get to that trauma lens is really to help people get to a place where they're able to make a mindset shift, because I think we've been socialized and we've learned a certain way of thinking about behaviors, and about how to manage behaviors, and about how to keep everyone safe, and create a learning environment, or whatever it is. And so we wanted to have a mindset shift, and what kind of education, and who all needs to have that mindset shift. And then also what is it going to take for them to have that mindset shift? And so we hope that, you know, enough education and enough understanding about what the information, what the research says, you know, what are the best practices and evidence-based practices that really show us how we can operate with that trauma lens. So thank you guys for making those 2 points. Do you guys have any other thoughts to add? Nona or Marilyn? Lisa? All right, so we'll move on to the next question. Next slide, please. And this one is about partnering with youth and families. We have experience through this conference, which is pretty exciting, the ways in which we've partnered with young people to deliver this conference. And so that is a great example. And we've also heard it mentioned in various sessions about how to do that and how to do that well, and also about partnering with families. So that's the question that I want to pose. And I want to start with Nona because I just know that she has done some work around partnering with youth and families. And so I want to ask, you know, what do authentic partnerships look like? How would they be authentic within this tribal juvenile justice system?
I think that from the get-go, I think understanding the dynamics of the young person's makeup of what their family and home life may look like. Who are those people that are involved in this young person's life that can be of a support for them while they're dealing with, you know, whatever they may be in the juvenile justice system for, so that they can then deal with whatever issues may be causing them to be in the system. So, you know, are there people in this young person's life that can help them create healthier behaviors, help them figure out, you know, what may be causing, what trauma they may be experiencing, so that they can help create moving forward a better plan, so that they don't get stuck in this cycle of going in and out of the juvenile justice system. Because I think when our youth go into these systems, it's because they don't have, you know, certain sorts of support either at home, if they have a stable home, or maybe they are couch surfing. But if they have even one person in their life that can, you know, check in with them or be of support in some way, if that's another relative, or if it is their immediate family, making sure that that is clear so that they can be part of the process of getting this youth through the system in a way that is going to help them be healthier and more moving forward, growing into a healthier adult, so that they, again, don't get stuck in this cycle of going in and out of the justice system, you know, going into adulthood. That's like figuring out how we can create those relationships with the family early on, so that these youth don't get stuck in the system.
Lisa, do you have anything to add to this topic?
Building trust and relationships is like the foundation of having a partnership with youth, families, and even stakeholders within a juvenile justice system. With youth, it's not just only spending time with them when they are like in the system or having court appearances or meetings. It's spending time with them on their own terms or in their own turf, whether it's their home, taking them, you know, going to school and sitting down and having like a private lunch with them in another room. I've done that before. Or just, you know, spending time where it's not always just focused on, you know, what the issue or concern is, but building that relationship as well. And I think it's really important for workers to establish relationships with all the, like silos or system silos, whether it's law enforcement, courts, other juvenile justice like workers or that system, schools, families, anything that is surrounding the youth. It's building a relationship and a trust with all, so you can truly advocate for the tribal youth and families as well.
Thank you guys so much for your comments on this. I think it's such an important piece of it. I know working within school systems that we tend to, want to solve the problems, and we forget to include the voices who are impacted by those problems, right? And so we get into our own system and the way that it functions and making it function well for us as the practitioners, and really looking at your system, really looking at your program, and seeing how it can function better for youth and for families who are the people that we are there for. And so thank you guys so much for making those comments. Anybody else want to add to this before we move on? All right, so we'll go ahead and go to the next topic, and which is another essential component of a trauma-informed juvenile justice system, and that's cross-system collaborations. And we've heard some great examples of that being showcased this week. And so I just want to ask our panelists, and I'll start with Lisa, what kind of collaborations are important for creating more trauma-informed tribal juvenile justice systems? You've mentioned some of those things. If you could elaborate a little bit more about those collaborations that really are helpful and effective for trauma-informed care.
I think the answer, just to build off my answer from the last question, is again like building trust and relationships with everyone that's involved. I think it's also really important that when there is an issue or a concern, for stakeholders to come together so that the youth only has to tell like their story or what's going on once rather than multiple times and in different silos. I think that is being that's more trauma informed than having that youth having to tell his or her stories or their stories multiple times. I'll just leave it at that.
Nona, do you have anything to add?
Just building off of what Lisa has mentioned, I think it's a super important point, I think, because as tribal communities, we tend to, different departments get different grants, but they have the same deliverables, but then oftentimes don't collaborate together to see like, how can we work together to fully get everything that we want out of this grant funding and these deliverables that they want us to meet? How can we work together to create the best system for the youth that we're serving? And if it's different departments or different programs or even different places where this youth is present. So like the school, or maybe they're in the foster care system, or maybe they're being taken care of by their grandparents, or have they been involved in any system that they may be present in. Is that system involved in this process? Because each system may have a different experience with this young person. And so if we don't know the full experience of what this youth is experiencing in that specific system, we may be doing a disservice to the youth and maybe not reaching or meeting a need that they have that isn't being communicated when siloing happens, because it does happen. And it's just something that it just happens over time, and it's not necessarily the fault of anybody. It's just, we get these grants and we get the deliverables and whatnot that we want to meet, but then we forget about how can we cross collaborate to make sure that we are best serving the youth in our community the best way that we can in the most trauma informed way.
I really thank you guys for your comments. What that brings to my mind is just, we're really looking at like a community-wide effort, right? A community-wide system. And really the idea that each systems in our communities, each systems that our students interface with, they're interdependent, right? One can only do as well and as good in serving the youth and meeting whatever needs that they may have if they are working together with the other systems. And so that interdependence, and also I really appreciate, your comments, Nona and Lisa, about, really knowing the youth and what their experience is and really coming from it from their perspective. So you don't want them to repeat their story over and over and re-traumatize them in that way. And you also want to make sure that, their needs are being met and they're not falling through the cracks because they're involved with all these different systems and may have different plans and may be connected to interfacing with different grants and programs. So thank you guys so much for those comments. I am now going to move us on. And this is actually the purpose of this session today, and that is we want to get to questions from participants. And so first, we're going to get to the questions that participants posed during registration. So we did have quite a number of them during registration that came in. And then if we have time, we're going to go to questions from that people are posing today. So some of them might be repeated. So we'll try to, to make best use of the time, we'll try to be aware of the repeat questions. But I want to start us off by this question, and it kind of has a preface. And so I think you guys have a kindred spirit out there, or we have a kindred spirit, a person who says that she or he has experienced a positive impact growing up with access. And when implemented as best practices, I think that person's referring to trauma-informed care. And as an educator in an urban community, she says, he or she says, I have also practiced trauma-informed care, SEL, ACEs, and restorative transformative justice. As an advocate of the impacts these ways have on our youth in and outside of the school and community, how can we advocate the importance of shifting towards a trauma-informed approach as a holistic goal, shifting the energy working within tribal communities? So I'm going to go ahead and let Marilyn take a stab at this first.
You read my lips, didn't you? So what comes to mind, because I had to read it a couple of times, is just really thinking about what that word holistic means. And it really just means the whole person, or or the whole system. So I feel like the becoming trauma-informed is very much about looking at the whole person, their history, their family's history, their community history, and particularly their trauma history. But along with that, there's also the need to look at the resilience of that individual adolescent or their family or their community, and really think and build an approach that addresses all of those aspects of that youth in your juvenile justice system. So yes, they might have these trauma histories, but they're also still here, right? They're in your program now, and you have an opportunity to build on whatever resiliency or whatever safety practice that have kept them well enough to maybe stay in school, or well enough to stay in the community, and to really build on those. So I feel like it's just, even though we're calling it trauma-informed, I feel like it really, the whole trauma-informed conversation is wrapping the individual in understanding the challenge, the impact on their physiology, their relationships, their psychology, their education, and any factor that interferes with their well-being, while also building on those strengths that they have in order to further develop their well-being.
Does
That's
anybody?
what
Thank you, Marilyn. Does anyone else want to add to her comments?
I was going to say from the community component to that question is sometimes it's about coming together around one common vision or goal for the well-being of the youth in the community, right? Not necessarily just the juvenile justice involved youth or a specific youth, but collectively, what is that goal, that hope for children throughout the community, and then coming together, stakeholders, community members, everybody within the community, and saying, what's my piece to that? What's my piece to getting that these youth closer to what it is that the goal is, what it is that the vision is for their wellness. And so sometimes I think that can be harmonizing in a way, because it's something that typically folks can come together around. What do we want for the youth here? And then who has what piece to that, and how do we work together to accomplish that?
That reminds me of in my work that I've done in Montana, that's something that comes up, right? Because when you're working with youth and you're an advocate or you're an ally to youth, you're trying to remind people about, putting the youth first. And so sometimes, as adults, we have all these other things that come into play. We have like funding, or we have, different politics that happen in a community, or, whatever relationships are happening within a community. And so, and people have different focus areas. And so one of the things that we tried to remind everyone was, let's think about the youth first. Let's remember we're all here for this common goal, and that's for the youth, and what we want for them and what we hope for them. So that's a really good point that you bring up, Laura. Does anybody else want to add anything to this?
Just recognizing that, too often in our communities around something that we're trying to do, whether it's suicide prevention or justice, it's, we get this idea in our minds that, oh, that's what these 5 people do. That's our suicide prevention, is these 5 people. And we don't want trauma, informed care to be, oh, that's this team, this trauma team that's going to take care of it for the entire community. It really is about building that amongst everyone. How can we all contribute to this? And even thinking about juvenile justice systems, how can everyone contribute to keeping youth out of the juvenile justice system, and or prevent that from happening in the first place? How do we actively think about that and continue to support each other?
Yes, I think you make a good point about that, because within a lot of our communities, I think a lot of us have really good intentions. And so, it's really trying to be inclusive. And I think that's a trauma informed, to be transparent and to be inclusive. Those are trauma informed concepts. And so really, thinking about how in each of our work, whether it's suicide prevention or whether it's substance abuse prevention, like we think about how that ties to trauma, right? And so we're not siloing, as Maegan explained. We think about how, trauma can be at the root of some of those issues that we're trying to address and trying to support and help our young people with. So I want to move on to the next question that we received, and that question is, it says, our communities experience a higher than normal rate of exposure to trauma. How can we help our services become more trauma informed, including our courts? So I think we've all touched on a little bit about this, but if we want to directly answer, and I'll let Marilyn try this first.
Can you repeat the question? I'm trying to find it on our sheet.
I'm sorry. I tried to group the questions around similar ones, but this
Okay.
was one on our communities experience a higher than normal rate of exposure to trauma. Our tribal communities, how can we help our services become more trauma informed, including our courts? So we talked about policies and procedures. We talked about educating staff. We talked about partnering with youth and families, and we talked about cross-system collaboration. So is there anything more to add that you want to add to this, Marilyn?
Yeah, yes. I think that, so it doesn't take a lot of convincing for us to, when we're talking about our communities, to really, we don't have to be convinced that we're experiencing higher rates of trauma than the general population. And so I think it's really, but at the same time, really realizing the extent of the exposure to adverse events in the lives of our children and our youth. I'm thinking of one example of a colleague who did a Sentinel study for Head Start students in Spokane, Washington. And Sentinel meaning that they interviewed the people in the 3 and 4 year old Head Start program, their caregivers, and these caregivers had to know if a child had experienced any of the ACEs questions. They couldn't suspect it, had to know it. So for these 3 and 4 year olds in Spokane, which is a very there's several tribes there that are represented in those communities, but it's mostly non-people of color. And in that Head Start, the 3 and 4 year olds had already had ACE scores of 3 and 4. Which is really pretty high when you think about it. So really realizing the prevalence of it is going to be really important to that, recognizing what it looks like in an adolescent, what it looks like in early childhood, what it looks like in an elementary school, parents, grandparents, the community, recognizing what those behaviors mean so that when we try to get involved in a relationship with that youth or their family, that they have better outcomes because we recognize what those behaviors mean and that they are based in trauma, and that with people with very high rates of trauma and trauma histories often are engaging, really unhelpful in engaging in helping relationships, right? They are triggered easily. They bounce out of treatment, they bounce out of care, they bounce out of the system that's supposed to be there to support and care about them and give support their healing. Then just really within the context of our system, not re-traumatizing, thinking about those policies, those procedures, those practices and approaches that aren't trauma-informed, that aren't helpful. Right? Restraint, seclusion, expulsion, suspension. It's about building those connections, like Laura said. How do we build those connections? How do these policies and procedures work in our agency to be able to build connection with that client, that student, or that patient? And for courts, it really is important for judges. There's one story that I just love. Judge Howard is part of our traumatic stress network. And he tells the story of how he sort of clued into trauma. And he was a juvenile court judge in Ohio. And it was Christmas time. So he was writing release orders for all the kids in juvenile detention to go home for the holidays. And there was a 14-year-old girl that flipped out. I think she tried to kick down a steel door, attacked an attendant. And for the first time, he stopped and thought to himself, what kid doesn't want to go home for Christmas? So he brought her into his chambers and he asked her what was going on. Come to find out that a relative would visit every Christmas and he was a perpetrator of sexual abuse. And this year she had made the conscious decision that she was not going to be there when he was there for the holidays. So she did something that she knew would get her in juvenile detention through the holidays. So children are engaging in all kinds of unhelpful behaviors in order to protect themselves and really understanding that. So in a courtroom, lecturing doesn't work, but being empathetic and compassionate and supportive does work. Understanding that those youth that are before you may look like they don't care, but they're terrified, you know, of what's going to happen to them, and really begin engaging in those connecting, trying to connect with that youth and that family. And we have training, we have youth court assessment, self-assessments that we can walk people through if they're interested. So that's one of our resources, and just training the judges on how to be more supportive of and cognizant of the trauma histories of the people that are in their courtroom.
Does anyone else have anything to add to Marilyn's comments?
I'll
Okay,
just say that it's kind of a misconception that some people have that trauma-informed care is really about being empathetic all the time, and that there's no limit setting or no accountability. And you may be thinking, you know, how do we get that across? And that's really, a trauma-informed care is about limit setting. It is about having boundaries. It is about holding people accountable for their actions. But the way that we do that really matters about how we go about, you know, doing that in relationship, because otherwise it's not going to make an impact in the long run. And what's the alternative? What's the alternative to, there's a lot of things that we can do before getting to the place of seclusion, restraints, things that Marilyn talked about. And there's a lot of approaches that we can take. And so I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Megan. Does anybody else want to add to this before I move on? Okay. The next question is asking what considerations should be given to culture when thinking about trauma-informed approaches. So I will ask Lisa maybe to start the conversation.
So I consider myself a traditional person, meaning that I go to ceremonies, raise my kids in that way. And when I am working as a professional, I like to carry that over to the tribal youth that I'm working with as well. So just with my own children, my children know that I can be soft, but you know, just as Maegan was saying, when boundaries need to be set, they know that I can also get pretty tough. And with youth, that's how I would act in a professional way as well. So I would always, I always treat them like they're my relatives. And I always like to consider myself that I'm their auntie or sister or whatever that role is in relation to, age or whatever. But in our tribal communities, just, like the auntie role is a very important role. And I always like to carry that over. As for bringing in, like other types of culture, it's really dependent on each individual community. For example, I'm Ojibwe, and what would be culturally appropriate in working in Ojibwe communities may be very different than like Veronica's community from where she's from, because there's such a diversity in tribal communities as well.
I think that's one aspect in the work that I've done of like indigenizing the work that we do is it really is unique to each community to decide what knowledge and practices and what's appropriate within a system of care, and what's how to connect with spiritual folks in the community or elders in the community, and what things to share and what things to do. I know when we do work with schools, we are mindful of that, it's really up to the community to decide what kinds of cultural practices they think is appropriate within a school system. And I think that can be the same can be said about the juvenile justice system. So it really is truly unique to each tribe and community. I do want to see if anybody else has anything else to add to that.
I would just add that when speaking of culture in relation to the justice system, and I'm coming at it from, I guess, a health perspective, and even in how you would approach a young person. I'm thinking of our youth who may be in the puberty age and experiencing issues with their health that they may not feel comfortable disclosing to whoever is their person while they're in the system, whether it's the officer or, if they're incarcerated, if it's the guard or if it's their case manager or whoever that person is that they need to be in contact with or talk to about whatever their needs are, that if this person, culturally, if in their culture, in their tribal belief system, if that person needs to be of the same gender or the opposite gender, that be taken into consideration, because that to me is trauma informed, because that youth may not be comfortable disclosing something in particular to their own bodily autonomy, because their bodily autonomy at that point is pretty much not their own, except for how they receive, potentially, hopefully receiving care while in a juvenile justice system. So are they getting their reproductive health needs met? Are they receiving care to get their, if they are menstruating, are they getting those needs met? Because that can affect even their confidence and their self-esteem if those needs are not being met and taken care of while they're dealing with whatever they're dealing with while in the system. Have they had access to testing if they have been engaging in risky behaviors? Have those conversations been had? This also may be where abuse allegations or disclosures may be brought up also. So making sure that those specific people if they have specific ways that they address those things with the same gender or opposite gender, that is available to the youth so that those needs can be taken care of and met.
That's such a great point, Nona, as we don't often think about that. I think we just think any supportive adult is good, but not really thinking about within the context of how they understand what's appropriate culturally and how they carry themselves and how they want to be in relationship with folks, and what conversations they want to have with who. And so that's a really good point to make. I do want to ask one more question before we move on to the audience questions, but that question I think is pretty important to think about, because trauma-informed care, we often talk about it in terms of like an individual and their personal traumas. So this question is about, is historical trauma the root cause of intergenerational trauma? What can tribal programs do to address the root causes of intergenerational trauma? And what services and methods are most effective to explain and address intergenerational trauma? So I'm going to go ahead and let Lisa and Nona try to answer these questions.
Nona, do you want to take a stab at it first?
Okay, that's such a loaded question. Hang on, let me find it. Okay, there it is. So the first question is historical trauma the root cause of intergenerational trauma? And I would say a broad yes, but that's such a loaded question that I don't think that we can definitively say that every single instance of intergenerational trauma is because of historical trauma. However, I think if you do, if a person can trace back through their family line to a certain point where, you know, an event of historical trauma has occurred, and then you look at the generations that have come since that event happened, is the trauma responses that that person or that family experiencing a result of that event? And has there been an instance where it has been acknowledged? And if it's been acknowledged, has the healing process begun? If the healing process has not begun, or if it's not been acknowledged, then definitely I think that historical event, which can be considered historical trauma, could then, you know, contribute to intergenerational trauma. I think that because we have not had as much access to this information as a people on a you know, big level, in the big picture, that we are not aware of how our family norms can be intergenerational trauma. It's just how it is. It's just been such a pattern for so many generations that it's become normalized. But I think that because of the mass group trauma that we have experienced as a people, a lot of the behaviors and ways that we function as families can be passed intergenerationally for sure. So I will let Lisa add on to that or move on to the next question, because that's such a big, broad question.
I think it's really important for workers to always just keep it in mind that all communities, whether they're tribal or other BIPOC communities or even just European Americans, we have all experienced trauma. That's part of our human experience, you know, just living day-to-day life. In respect to tribal communities, one of the first court cases I had, you know, like in my child welfare career, I was very new. We had children who were removed from their mother and placed with their grandmother. And the grandmother was supposed to supervise any visits if the mother came over, or notify the caseworker ahead of time to get approval. But we found like the grandmother was letting the mom come over without, you know, like myself as a caseworker knowing. And this kind of became, you know, like, well, the grandmother isn't doing her job. But in a court hearing, she was very vulnerable and said, you know, I remember growing up and being removed from my parents and not being able to see them. She's like, I cannot put my grandchildren through the same thing. And that was such a epiphany for myself. And it's about how to treat, you know, tribal communities, and lessening trauma is grandma was still the boss of her house, and whether or not we lessened the restrictions on her having to gain permission of letting mom come over, because she would protect her grandbabies at no cost, but then allowing for the mom and, you know, like children to be around and the family to interact around, and for grandma to also bring that grandmotherly love and teachings that she brings as well. I think that's the best way that we can be trauma informed in our communities.
That is so well said, Lisa. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there's just so much that can be said on this topic of intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, and just trauma in general. And so we unfortunately are short on time. So I don't see any questions from the audience so far. And so we are going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. Do you guys have any resources that came to mind as you were answering these questions that you are dying to share with the audience?
Just that we have some resources. I think they're on our website about in response to COVID. Even though we're all getting vaccinated and we're feeling hopeful, I think that there's still some psychological and emotional impacts around COVID. And I'm sure everyone in this meeting understands that the National Congress of the American Indian has resources around COVID, the National Indian Health Board, Indian Health Service, National Indian Health Service, National Indian Child Welfare Association, Tribal Law and Policy Institute, Tribal Youth Resource Center, and us. So they're out there, they're online, and they're very good. They're very much about supporting your children and youth and one another during this really stressful time.
I would like to share a few resources with people just in regard to how they may be able to start having these conversations with the youth that they're serving if these conversations aren't happening, which in my experience with reproductive health and sexuality education, they normally are not. It's still a taboo subject in some cases. And so part of being trauma informed, I feel, is acknowledging that and starting those conversations so that our youth can be best served in every aspect, which that is part of holistic approaches to caring for the whole person. And so wearenative.com, is it .com or .org, is a website full of so many resources outside of just reproductive health care and sexual health care. There's a lot of things on there specifically for youth, but I think even going through it as a youth serving professional could be really helpful, especially if you're not well versed in, specific areas. And also for specifically for reproductive health care and, accessing testing and birth control and all that of the Planned Parenthood national website, or any website for Planned Parenthood within your state. Could have resources for parents, caretakers, and how to have these conversations with their young people, or you as a youth serving professional, just to kind of, learn more. We can always learn more about everything, and it's such a good resource for that kind of information, and maybe something to print out that you could share with youth that you do serve while they are under your service.
Just put a link in the chat for everybody that is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network Juvenile Justice Court self-assessment. So there's information there. I will say that we have made quite a few adaptations to that to be specific to tribal courts. So we can connect with you about that as well, but there's some generic information there on that website.
Thank you, guys. I also want to remind folks that we do have resources in the conference booklet that has our resources for this session, and including the essential elements of a trauma-informed juvenile justice system. And then also there is a resource room where you'll find other types of resources, including resources related to the pandemic. So I would point you guys to those as well. And many of those resources come from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which we are a part of. Next slide, please. So in closing, I just want to acknowledge that this work can be hard work and that sometimes it can be tiring. And so one of the things that's really helpful to each of us is to think about why we do this work and maybe hopes and dreams that we have for our youth. And so in closing, I just want to share a few words, nothing too deep, but for me, I want youth to feel happy and to feel free and to be healthy. And I think that's what the photo on this slide shows. And so I'm going to just briefly ask each of the panelists to share a few words that represents what they hope their hopes and dreams are for the Native youth. Marilyn?
My hope and the reason that I do this work is I have a vision of a tribal community that's healthy and whole and has returned to its cultural and spiritual roots, and that is supportive and caring and if there is injury, whether it's emotional, psychological, or physical, that the entire community responds to bring healing to one another. That's my big hope.
Nona?
Mine is very similar to Marilyn's, that we are helping to heal communities from, things that have happened to our people since contact, and to help these next ones coming up behind us to grow into healthy individuals at from the very beginning, and not, having to wait until they're teenagers or adults to start addressing or acknowledging what maybe they are experiencing, and just creating healthy communities from the womb, and parenting and everything. So hoping that the youth also have voice over their how they're growing, how they're experiencing things in their community, and contribute to that process as well, as it's part of their journey too.
Laura?
Yeah, I think who youth are meant to be is already inside them. It's coming from their ancestors, it's coming from their community, it's coming from their tribe. And I think that my hope, that why I'm here, is to really just do whatever piece there is to do to help youth become who they were always meant to be, who they have been, who they are on the inside, and so that they can be that outward facing as well.
Lisa?
I always just like to think of myself that I am here because of all the things that my ancestors have gone through and survived. And I like to think about my great, 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 great grandchildren, and what we can do now to ensure that, we have healthy communities and our culture is intact, and that our tribal children know who they are, for generations and generations and generations to come.
Maegan?
Yeah, I think we share a lot of the same hopes for this work, and really just supporting the self-determination of tribes to figure out how they want to heal, and what they want to bring in to facilitate that healing, is really fundamental. What we bring in is important, but more importantly, it's how we go about healing. This process should be healing in and of itself, and I hope that we all can work towards that together, in our own ways, in our own communities. And thank you so much for all of your work, and healing that you bring to your work day in and day out.
Next slide. This has been brought to you by OJJDP. And if you want to visit the website of the Tribal Youth Resource Center, it's www.tribalyouth.org, and you can request TTA from the National Child Traumatic Stress or National Native Children's Trauma Center at that website. Next slide.
Thank you for attending session E4, Enhancing Tribal Juvenile Justice with Trauma-Informed Systems Change Trauma Center Expert Panel. As a reminder, there is a link for workshop session evaluation in the chat box. Please click on this link now and take a moment to complete the survey. There's also a sign that links to session evaluations in the main virtual lobby. Additionally, at the conclusion of your participation in the 2021 OJJDP Tribal Youth Virtual National Conference, we ask that you take a moment to complete the overall evaluation. There is a sign located in the virtual lobby to access it. Please click the overall evaluation sign to open the survey and complete it before you leave the conference for the last time. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. If you have been unable to join a session that you're interested in, a recording will be posted on this platform and will remain up until April 30th. After this time, you may find recordings of all conference sessions at tribalyouth.org.
Next slide.